to biomass fuel, cooking, combustion with other auxiliary drivers such as expansion of agricultural land, sporadic urbanization, and income poverty, industrialization, and inadequate incentives for private plantation forests. About 90% of Ugandans use firewood and charcoal for cooking. Other challenges include encroachment, illegal harvesting, and titling. Similarly, the national wetlands coverage as a percentage of the total land area declined from 15.6% in 1994 to 8.9% currently. It is estimated that Uganda loses 846 square kilometers of its wetlands annually. The major cause of wetland degradation are poor farming practices, unplanned urbanization and settlements, excessive water abstraction, income poverty, poor intra and inter-sector coordination with regards to continued issuance of land titles in wetlands, sand mining and industrialization of with some of the demarcated business industrial parks located in wetlands. Well-managed wetlands, riverbanks, and forests make communities resilient to extreme weather events and disasters, such as floods, prolonged drought, and incidences of water scarcity. While there are a number of ongoing efforts by the various ministries and the agencies of government and other stakeholders to restore wetlands, riverbanks, and forests, a lot needs to be done as follows. There is need to secure the boundaries of wetlands, riverbanks, and forests, and also gazette and strictly protect those that provide critical functions that avert climate change impacts. There is need to protect and restore water catchments, especially those that have been degraded. There is a need to remove pressure from wetlands, riverbanks, and forests by creating alternative livelihoods that are economically viable. Ladies and gentlemen, Uganda has also, over the last 1 year, been experiencing rising water levels of major water bodies and intensive rainfall since September 2019. These are having very big flooding in several parts of the country due to prolonged and impacts on property, infrastructure, and people's lives. This is due to increased settlements and developments in floodplains, poor agricultural practices, and deforestation. These have made the soils loose and the steep slopes bare, and allowed water to move very fast to valleys immediately after rains. The above factors have all combined to worsen the flooding problem. Government is currently implementing measures to manage the perennial occurrence of floods in and around the country. These include, among others, protection of water catchments and the general environment, regular maintenance of water bodies and the rivers so that they perform their water storage and the conveyance function, construction of water reservoirs, demarcation and the protection of lake shores, river banks, and the wetlands to limit encroachment by settlements, agricultural activities, and other development, and the strengthening of enforcement of the water and environmental laws at all levels. Ladies and gentlemen, Another big problem is the plastics we see around. This has become the most dominant waste in the country, both on land and in our water bodies. More than 600 tons of plastic is disposed of each day. The country has a large number of inland freshwater bodies which are being suffocated by plastic litter. This is in addition to the pollution caused on land, in the drainage systems, in towns, dump sites, and the parks. The country thus recognizes the threat and the dangers posed by waste, and the particular plastic litter and associated pollution, and has put in place a number of measures to address the problem as follows. We enacted the 2019 environmental law, which bans carrier bags that are under 30 microns. Government has imposed producer extended responsibility as part of polluter pays principle. This will ensure that producers of materials with potential to pollute will have the duty to follow the management of their product through its life cycle. The law has brought on board a cross-section of other actors to implement the provision of the law on plastic pollution. Government has also imposed mandatory condition to all plastic manufacturers to establish recycling plants and ensure that they follow their plastic material and bring it back for recycling. This is a precondition for licensing any plastic manufacturing enterprise. Specific emphasis has been put on nationwide, multi-sectoral, multimedia, critical environmental literacy and campaigns to empower citizens to follow the right waste management hierarchy. I want to thank the education sector, which has taken the lead in slapping a total ban on plastic carrier bags in all our education institutions. Awareness creation in schools is being done through the different environment education initiatives. The plastic recycling sector is being improved in order to reduce the amount of plastic waste entering the environment. I wish therefore to call upon all Ugandans to support all efforts to address the problem of plastic pollution. Ladies and gentlemen, water and environment resources don't recognize administrative boundaries. These resources are shared with other countries by various local governments and by various people. Thus, their rational and equitable development and management is key to growth of the country. The varying uses of water are interlinked and require sustainable exploitation and management to ensure that there is adequate water of the right quality and the quantity for both production and domestic use, even during the dry seasons. Thus, considering that water and environment resources are at the core of sustainable development and are critical for socio-economic development, healthy ecosystems, and for human survival, these resources will be critical in the achievement of the NDP 3 goal and the targets. I am therefore happy to note that the theme of the 4th Uganda Water Environment Week is water environment security for socio-economic transformation of Uganda. I also know that this event is celebrated under 4 sub-themes: namely A, valuing water and environmental resources for socio-economic transformation of Uganda. B, water and environment in a creative economy. C, managing water and environment shocks. And D, water and environment security for smart urban growth. This is a befitting theme and a sub-theme for the fourth Uganda Water and Environment Week, more so at a time when the country is facing challenges caused by COVID-19, rising water levels, flooding, and job loss. I therefore request all the participants of the fourth Uganda Water and Environment Week to critically discuss how water and environment security can be ensured to enable the country address the current challenges and contribute to socio-economic transformation through inclusive growth, employment, wealth creation in line with the NDP 3 goal. I therefore have no doubt that the outcome of this Uganda Water and Environment Week will make significant contributions to enabling Uganda achieve the National Development Plan 3 goals and targets. I wish to recognize the organizations and development partners that have continued to support the Ministry of Water and Environment to deliver water and environment resources to the people of Uganda. On behalf of the government of Uganda, I wish to thank you for this support and request you to continue providing such support so that this critical sector of government can perform its key functions of sustainable development and the management of water and environment resources for the benefits of Ugandans. I wish all of you very fruitful deliberations during this week. I wish to formally declare the 4th Uganda Water and Environment Week formally open. For God and my country.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister deserves a bigger hand clap. We are now going to move into the keynote speech, and we have a professor all the way from Colorado, and is ready. Allow me now introduce Professor Ken Stresbeck. Professor Ken is a leading researcher and practitioner at the nexus of engineering, environmental, and economic systems related to civil infrastructure, with a focus on water, food, and energy systems and climate change adaptation. He investigates the role of climate change and infrastructure development on economic growth and poverty reduction. Stresbeck is a research scientist at the MIT Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change. He has spent 40 years as a researcher and practitioner. He is joining us through Zoom. And Professor, you're most welcome, and you're going to give us a keynote address in 25 minutes, or if you like, under 25, on water and environment security for socio-economic transformation of Uganda. Professor, you're most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are you able to hear me in Kampala?
Very clearly, Professor.
Yes, if the host could open my screen sharing, I will share my slides with you. It is with great pleasure that I join you today, very humbly that I can be with you, and I want to thank you for this invitation. And as we prepare our slides, I would like to thank all of the previous speakers, and as I open, to acknowledge the Prime Minister and his representatives who are here today, the Minister of Water, and all of the other distinguished speakers. And I'm extremely honored that we would have such wonderful young Ugandans with us today. As we know, the future of Uganda is in its youth, and to hear such wonderful poetry from them about the topic today is outstanding. So if the host could release so I can share my screen. They're not allowing participant screen sharing. So
you need to get host right.
Yes.
Professor, that preparation is being made.
Okay, good. So while that's beginning, I will start a little bit, and then you can see that this morning my heart is with you in Uganda while I am here in Colorado, 10,000 kilometers away. But I want to tell you that I tried to make a part of Uganda with me this morning. Ah, wonderful. We can now share. Okay, so can you see our opening slide?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, so as I said, because I couldn't be with you, I am here partially in that I'm drinking my coffee here at 5 in the morning, and that coffee comes all the way from Mount Elgon. So every morning I'm able to have part of you as I prepared this work. And also, I made my own Rolex for breakfast this morning. So, as much as I can with you, I'm trying to be there today. So, let's see if we can share, because Dr. Kalis said there would be lunch, but he said it was too hard to ship by DHL to me. So, we will be a part of you today. What I wanted to talk today about was to link two things. What do we know about economics and water and environment, and then also what's going on with the theme of this conference and workshop, and can we bring some information directly to it to hopefully start it off in the right direction and bring up some questions and issues that have been going on in Uganda. So the first thing here, so we want to address that the goal of NDP 3 is industrialization. We see that. Successful industrialization of the economy. So this is really important because, as we'll see a little bit later, that is generally the path to increase incomes and move labor from low-paid agriculture to better industrial development. However, there is a threat when we work with industrialization and over the past. And there is a famous Harvard economist called Kuznets, and he developed a curve which has been adopted by environmental economists and development economists that show that there has been traditionally this path as you move through economic development, which is basically income per capita. So if we assume that dashed line on the left-hand side is where Uganda is now, and NDP 3 wants to get us to the dashed line on the right, historically, all the Western countries and many of those have gone on this path that the more you develop, the more you degrade your environment through pollution, destroying resources like wetlands and forests, which we've heard quite a bit about. And my distinguished colleague from UNDP, we're going to address some of those issues of forestry as well today, not just water, as we move forward. So as we have this threat, what I want to come is to bring a warning. What is the warning that we have is, let's go look at another country. which is Vietnam. And what's the cautionary tale here? Is if we look on this plot at the bottom, we see that it rapidly grew and passed the middle income threshold, which we know is a goal of the government of Uganda. But as it went along, it had good resources. But if we look again, what we see is from a recent study that we were just involved with, is that this growth is 5% less than it could have been had they not trashed the environment or polluted. So while we think this path that we just showed in that curve is something that would be beneficial for the government, as we've looked at this, here's these results. We did an analysis like we did in Uganda, and untreated water on health is leading to a 3.5% decrease in GDP alone, and water stress from not taking into account good water resource management is another 1.2. So almost all of this 6% impact on GDP loss was due to water management and pollution. And so how can we go forward? Is it possible to grow? Well, there is a theory that's out there that we're at a crisis. And so there's a famous quote by President John F. Kennedy, who quoted the Chinese symbol of crisis, which says when you're at a crisis, you come and you bring danger and there's opportunity at that point. And what has happened is back then when Kennedy was speaking, America's knowledge of Chinese culture, I think, was not as good as it is now. And what they've said is that opportunity is a bad translation of the second character. It's more a turning point. And so one could view a turning point as an opportunity as well. So we're facing a crisis. Uganda wants to grow. The past, every other country in the world has seen this growth, but at the cost of the environment. Is it possible that there's a new way forward? And what that is this red line. Can Uganda go from pre-industrial to post-industrial, to middle income, without seeing this rapid degradation of the environment? And what I argue is that it can. And so development and environmental economists call this activity tunneling through the Kuznets curve. And can we tunnel through? Or we have heard so much about COVID, one of the things we keep hearing is flattening the curve. Can we do something to keep us from having this peak? And I argue we can. And that's what we want to talk about today as we go through the four themes that you've talked about. The first one is, as we look at this, where is water and environment? This is a list of projects from NDP 2. Nowhere in these priority projects is anything related to water and environment. But as was mentioned in the previous speech, we were fortunate with industrial economics to be part of the activity by the former minister who asked, what is the impact of investment in water environment on Uganda's growth? And the good news is that, like we found in Vietnam, if we invest in Uganda 2040 to enhance water supply, wetlands, forests, and catchment management, we can increase GDP by 2040 by 9%. How is this possible? This 9% is broken up into these different parts. By water and sanitation alone, that brings us about 3%. Providing water for livestock, what we call water for production, that brings another 10%. But what's important is, to go along with my colleague from UNDP, forest protection brings you on the order of 25% of that benefit. And then flood risk mitigation through wetlands and others brings an important part. So what we're able to see is in Uganda, these are numbers for Uganda, if we invest and take another step forward and do not, or if we tunnel through or bend the curve, people usually think that's going to come as a cost. They think protecting the environment, sustainability will slow down growth, and we're showing it's just the opposite, that it'll increase growth. And so how can Uganda do things differently? Uganda can chart a different path. our studies have shown that this stewardship will help it. But what we need to do is integrate water and environmental investment plans within a framework and tools for sustainable growth. So it's requiring all the ministries to work together and to come together at Cabinet to see that as we allocate budgets for investment and as there are investments in other sectors, that water and environment be part of that investment to protect the environment as we grow. We don't have to do it in spite of it. The next part that we've talked about is the theme today is the creative economy. And how does that fit with that? Well, one of the things that, as you look at the definition, is using creativity, using high tech, and that is something really important in water infrastructure. Making smart cities, making smart systems that will use the advantage of technology. And an example of that would be flood forecasting. What can we do by using satellite data, weather forecasts, etc.? And does that help in our growth? Well, what we found is, here's just one study of this, that a study was done for Europe that if we use flood awareness systems, that the benefits are 400 to 1 for investments in smart technologies for flood investment, for flood protection, over pouring concrete or building other things. Now, this is really high. I bet it's even lower, but even if it was 100 to 1, that would be a fantastic system. So as we study in some of the other work we've done in smart infrastructure, we need to come not only with just hardware or hard structures, but also management, adaptation, and other exciting technology. So we can bring the creative economy into a partnership with the future development of water and environmental protection. Those together will be very economically beneficial. As we move to our next theme here, water managing shocks. Now, this is something that we want to take a lot of time about because we need to understand a little bit why shocks are so detrimental to economies. And so one of the things here is we usually use GDP as a measure of the economy, and that's true. And on the right-hand side here is a little schematic which shows how is GDP produced. GDP is produced through what we call capital. And there's a new approach out there amongst economists called inclusive wealth, that a country's wealth is its capital, and there are three factors to its capital. The natural capital, which we heard about before, the beautiful pearl of Africa, the rainfall, the sunshine, the land that's there in Uganda. How can we use it? Then there is the produced capital, the buildings, the roads, the reservoirs, the hydro plants that we've developed. And then there is the so important human capital, the education that goes into the expertise that we see. Now, with everyone in the room, the human capital that's being developed in schools and coming forward. Those come into the economy, and just to be a little bit nerdy to wake everybody up this afternoon, here's an equation. A very simple thing of the economy is the output of an economy is a function of L, which is labor, and K, which is capital. So the amount of capital you have here will affect your output. And so what we have to do is we want to have sustainable development. Sustainable development in the new inclusive wealth work is that we keep growing this bound of capital and we don't deplete it. Now, the issue is, if we go ahead and look at this, shocks, what they do is they impact the capital. And so it's taking away from the ability of an economy to produce. And so it is very important to protect our capital. So here's an example, unfortunately, with my name, Cyclone Kenneth that just hit southern Africa. It damaged roads and bridges, which is that produced capital. And teams couldn't even reach the flood victims. But this is what the total economic damage to Mozambique alone was $1 billion, 8% of the total domestic product, the most extensive natural disaster. Most of that was destroying capital, bridges, farmlands, schools, homes. So next year, rather than building new capital, they were replacing the old capital, and it slows economic growth. And work we've done in Southern Africa, this is the biggest threat of climate change, is not drought, but floods, which destroys capital. And so the World Bank estimated for the three countries over $2 billion in damages. In our work looking at Uganda, what we found is that over the next 20 years, that enhanced investment in flood control could bring returns on the order of $10 billion. If we invest in flood control in two forms, mainly nature-based solutions of protection of wetlands, being careful how we develop, not to develop in floodplains, that we can bring a return of almost 10 to 1 on our investments in terms of flood protection, because what we're doing is protecting our capital. So as we move forward to this last theme of urban growth, we've had the privilege of working together with GIZ and the ministry and Dr. Calise and the steering committee to look at what was a project known as WASEP, the Water Security Action and Investment Plan for Uganda. And as we looked at that, one of the things we see here is that increased investment to a sustainable water secure future for Greater Kampala metropolitan area will lead to about 4.2 increase in GDP over the next 20 years. And that's an order of $195 per capita by 2040. And as we look at that, part of that is not just going to stay in the capital region, but it's going to go throughout all of Uganda through the linkages of economy. So these investments in developing that further goes through all of these different sectors as we look at that. And so we talk about this and say, well, what is the importance of that? You know, is this investment good? Because as we've said, there is not enough capital for investments for doing all the projects that Uganda needs. So how do we prioritize? And I showed at the beginning, where was water in that priority list? Well, we want to show what is the scale of this investment. So if we look at returns of other important projects, the oil production projects, during its initial phase is about 1.6% increase of GDP. At its peak, 7.2, in its last year, about 1. Climate change impacts are proposed to be about 1.5 to 2% impact. Malaria alone is about a -1. But if we look at investing in water secure Greater Kampala, we get on the order of 4% increase per year over the next 20 years. So investment in water security, investment in environmental protection is not a drag on the economy, slowing down growth and slowing down developing income, but what it is actually enhancing that. And as we've seen in Vietnam and many other places throughout the world, so Vietnam, we're looking back at data about what has happened. With our work, we're using a model of what could be in the future, and they're aligning together to say we need to worry about the environment as we move forward. So what are some of the big takeaway messages from the recent work that we've seen and from what other people are saying around the world? There was a very famous activity that took place in Stockholm. 13 of the world's leading economists, 4 former chief economists of the World Bank, and Nobel laureates were together, and they came out with some core principles, and it's called the Stockholm Statement. And they said, be careful, GDP growth is not an end in itself. Well, why it's important, and it measures things, what we want to do is development has to be inclusive, including all and bringing up everyone. But number 3 addresses this point. They have said environmental sustainability is a requirement, not an option. And these are not people from the Ministry of Water and Environment. These are chief economists sitting in cabinet, in the prime minister level, looking at global development. So that number 3, and I emphasize not an option there. What else have they shared with us? They said, as NDP 3 says, we need a structure of change in countries. We have to have this transformational change because agriculture is low productivity in terms of wages. If we want to increase the welfare of the citizens of Uganda to give them, drive them out of poverty, give them more resources, we have to move to things like industrialization. We have to move to higher productive services. But again, it has to be done sustainably and not at the cost of the environment. And then finally, as we've looked at this, all successful development has entailed government playing an important role. We all know PPP, public-private partnership, is crucial to development. But in terms of infrastructure and institutions, the government has to play a really important role to provide that infrastructure so that economic growth can come. Roads can't be built by individual firms. Roads have to be built by the government. Flood protection needs to be by the government. So the Ministry of Water and Environment is crucial in providing many of these physical infrastructures, but also the whole institutional infrastructure, providing the education to develop and be able to do things like smart economies and others to allow the country to grow. And then finally, one of the things we want to be careful at is Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who's a Nobel Prize laureate in economics and also was former chief economist of the World Bank, mentioned a few things, and he said, how do we measure performance and social growth? We want to be careful. And they said, impact on GDP may be misleading. We want to look at that because much of it can go to foreign owners and managers. And GDP does not include the value of resource depletion and environmental degradation. We've showed that we can do both. So we want to be careful, but just not to have a single measure. In many areas, adverse effects of environment and health can be very significant, as we've shown. GDP says nothing about sustainability or inclusiveness of growth. That's why some of these other metrics like inclusive wealth, which is related to the capital of human, natural, and productive, and the fact that we have to keep that growing to be sustainable. So what we said is you need to bear in mind what we measure affects what we do. If we measure the wrong thing, we'll do the wrong thing. So with that message in mind, we have to be careful as we move forward. And so the development challenge is great. But as I've worked over the last 15 years in Uganda, I see a great receptiveness to grow sustainably in Uganda. And if there are a few things that I think about as we look here is we have to listen across disciplines. Engineers have to talk to agronomists, have to talk to energy specialists, to social scientists. We need all resources on hand. We have to make sure the limited resources we have are used productively and without waste. We need to collect more data. We need evidence-based decision-making, and that needs to be based first on data. We can build models, but our models are only as good as the data that we validate them to. So we have to keep measuring our environment and other actions. We need to use all the tools that are out there. There have been many tools developed locally in Uganda with development partners. We have to use them together, and we need to train our staff in the public sector and in the private sector to use these tools. And finally, we need to communicate our findings in language for decision making. Many of us in the room today are engineers or economists or others. We have to make our message to be understood by policymakers so we can be there. And as Professor Stiglitz says, we have to be careful because the metric we use matter as we go forward. The last thing I want to do is to leave you with a message, since most of us here are engineers, to bring something from economics, which I think is a valuable view as we look at this. Kenneth Boulding, a very famous economist in the United States, said, if I'm going to live below a dam, I would much rather have it built by an engineer than an economist. So I think we can say amen to that. But nevertheless, the economist comes into the picture perhaps by asking the awkward question as to whether the dam should be built in the first place. So the issue is there is a great need across all sectors in Uganda. We only have limited amounts of investment from domestic investment sources and from donors and from loans and other things. And the question is, where is it best used? Because there's a concept in economics that I think we all need to take with us all the time, and that's called the opportunity cost. We could spend some money and it would do well, but how much more might it get from an alternative use if we spent it on somewhere else? So I think all of us need to come and have dialogue across sectors: agriculture, water, transport, energy, education. Where is that dollar best spent? And even within our ministries, where is it spent, so that we can get the most for it, because we have a limited resource. So finally, I thank you again for inviting me to be part of this. I cannot look forward enough until when I can be back and see you in person. I am happy to say that last week I got my second jab of Pfizer, so I'll be ready to come as soon as you'll let me there. I have 2 tickets that are still open to Kampala, which I hope to use soon. And I wish my blessing on this week, that the dialogue that will go forward will be productive, and the ultimate goal will be inclusive development for the wonderful citizens of Uganda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Are you still hearing from us? Hi, Professor.
Yes.
Thanks very much, and there has been Sandra's applause for you here in the room for your presentation, and thanks for drinking the Elgon, certainly Ugandan coffee, as well as eating from the rich ingredients in the Rolex. Though it was a little dark, in Uganda we don't make them dark, Professor. Well, we shall engage him as we move on. We are now preparing to go into the panel discussions, and as the panel comes up to the podium, Josephine and I will be inviting them one by one. We shall split the entire group into 2 so that we can have them in 2 different clusters. We will start with Miss Elsie Atafwa, the UNDP resident representative for Uganda.
So my job here is quite simple. As you make your way up, I will just speak a little about you. Ms. Elsie is the resident representative for Uganda UNDP. In this position, she leads and is accountable for harnessing and directing the full potential of UNDP's capabilities and associated partnerships in support of national development goals and strategies in Uganda. Prior to this, she led, managed, and coordinated UNDP's climate and forest team and office in Africa, and provided overall strategic direction, policy, and technical guidance to 28 countries in the Africa portfolio.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together for Elsie. She has already taken up her seat. The next panelist will be the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Water and Environment, Alfred Okoto Kidi, represented by Dr. Florence Grace Adongo.
All right. And as Dr. Adongo takes her seat on the podium, a little bit of information about her. She's the Director, Water Resources Management. She's the Chair, Uganda Water and Environment Week. She served in the water fraternity for 30 years under various positions. She's the first female director in the history of water and environment. She steered the launch of the Uganda Water and Environment Week 2018 and still carries on to support the team that is doing it now.
Thank you. Our next panelist will be Mr. Ramadan Gobi, a lecturer at Makerere University Business School.
Mr. Ramadan Gobi is an economist and policy analyst. He's a disciple of economics that works, and he teaches the same at Makerere University Business School. I think they were speaking about people like Mr. Ramadan Gobi when you are building a, was it a bridge? At Makerere University Business School, he heads a think tank, the MOVES Economic Forum. His research interests are in industrial policy, economic policy, and political economy. He is a regular pundit in media on economic issues and writes a weekly column, Are You Listening, Mr. President?, in the Sunrise newspaper. He has consulted with Overseas Development Institute, ODI, UK, International Labour Organization, International Monetary Fund, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Financial Sector Deepening Uganda, Government of Uganda, Action Coalition for Development and Environment, and many others. He is the director at the Uganda Development Corporation the government's investment arm.
Thank you, Josephine, and let's clap for them. There are two ladies on the podium and one gentleman, and therefore the gentleman is disadvantaged, so we will change the order and start with him instead of the ladies first. Ramadan, away from the questions that I had, I need you to start us off by making a 1-minute rejoinder. Professor Strezpek talked about the GDP as being the main measure of economic growth and all that, and we know that now, better informed, the world over, many people are saying GDP might actually be misleading in terms of water safety, environment which is sustainable, conservation. What is now, in your view, supposed to be the best, solution to looking at this? How do we achieve sustainability minus only talking about walls and tarmac for, for GDP growth?
Thank you very much, Charles, and good evening to all the participants. Protocols observed. I'm glad that the professor swung this keynote to the direction which is quite more comfortable for us economists these days. We're encouraging the world to look at development sustainably in terms of not necessarily looking at what we are accumulating in numbers which are read to us by those with the powers to read the numbers, but also by looking at what exactly is pertaining to our lives. Joseph Stiglitz, the professor he has quoted, we teach him now religiously in development economics because he transformed the thinking at World Bank on how we measure development, because at one time it was pure about GDP, and the GDP is like a calculator which only adds and it doesn't have a function for subtraction. You are only adding whatever has been produced, the monetary value in a year, but without looking at what cost, that opportunity cost, the concept he ended with. So there are of course alternatives which are being tried every day, and now that the UN brought us the Sustainable Development Goals, in there we have almost whatever it takes to look at alternative way of getting inclusive development. And in that, some have said, why don't we try gross national happiness? And we look at development more comprehensively, because the end result of every human being, why we wake up and work so hard or do whatever we do, we are searching for one major aspect, happiness. And this happiness, development economists have reduced it to 3 major aspects: the freedom to choose, the freedom of choice, self-esteem, and sustainable income. That word sustainability, sometimes we misunderstand it. It seems a bit complex, but in simple terms, it just asks us a question: whether in whatever we are doing to make ourselves happy, we are mindful of the future generation, that we must leave behind a stock of resources which is equivalent to what we inherited. So are we, when we are fishing in Lake Victoria, are we mindful that Lake Victoria must remain intact in the same way we inherited it for the future generation? That's the sustainability bit. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll pose my question to Ms. Elsie. As a UN agency, you support Uganda through many sectors, one of which is the water and environment sector. How critical are water and the environment resources in Uganda's socio-economic transformation?
Well, first, let me thank the Ministry for inviting the United Nations family to be on the panel, and I'm humbled to be here representing the team here, and the resident coordinator is here as well, and my colleague from FAO. Let me also say that this discussion is really timely for a number of reasons. First, when we're starting the rollout of the National Development Plan 3, and when we are also talking about the Sustainable Development Goals and the Decade of Action. In other words, there's a lot that we need to do within a short period of time. But it's also coming at a time that we are talking about post-COVID recovery and resilience building. And when we talk about building forward better, it is not only about building forward better, but also building forward greener. And this is very important, and this sets the tone for our conversation today. Now, to answer the question, the importance of water and environment to socioeconomic transformation, I want to situate it by looking at two parameters: the socio-economic transformation and the word security. That's very important. Now, when you look at Africa, and this, I'm going to tackle the first one first, the socio-economic transformation, the role of water and environment. In the case of Africa, and also Uganda in particular, our development is nature-based, and I think Professor Ken made my work easier by talking about that. What does it mean? It means that when we are seeking a development that will reduce poverty, when we are seeking a development that will create wealth, when we are seeking a development that says that leaving no one behind, we need to look at where does it come from. Now, you take the case of Uganda. Let's take the energy sector, for example. We get about 28% of our energy, electricity from hydro, which means, and I think if Karuma comes online, that's even more, which means that we need that energy for industrialization, and it comes from water. So you can already see the interconnection between water and energy and industrialization. You take the agriculture sector, for example, and my colleague Antonio is here, and he'll clearly tell you, you will need that water for irrigation, for example, and that's very important. 68 to 70% of our population here in Uganda are very much dependent on the agriculture sector. And therefore, you cannot talk about agriculture without talking about water. You cannot decouple the two. You talk about tourism, exactly the same thing. Environment and water is very much hinged. Tourism hinges on environment and water. If you take, for example, the places that we go to, our gorillas, they are in the forest. Our wetlands, the bears are there. So when somebody comes bird watching here, they come because of the wetlands. So you can already see that water and environment is not an add-on, as Professor Ken said. It is at the center of national development processes in the country. And I can go on and on. You also take the social services, for example. Health becomes very important. When the minister in waiting talked about the fact that, during COVID times, we need water to wash our hands. We need water for drinking. We need water for so many things. You can already link that to health. So by and large, the development agenda of Uganda is very much dependent on that, and therefore the way we are going to utilize resources becomes very important if we link it back to leave no one behind, if we link it back to increases in income, if we link it back to the agenda of the 2040 that we are all supporting. Now, let me then shift to the word security, because I don't think the organizers just put the word security there. Why security? Why water and environment security? Why does it matter for a country like Uganda? Now, it's very important that as we develop, we look at the trade-offs. It is very important because you can't be industrializing, opening up new wetland areas, therefore destroying your wetland, which comes at a cost to the country, because then you're going to spend more money for water, generating water quantity and quality. So the trade-offs have to be managed. In other words, as we look at development hinged on water and environment, we also have to think, how secure would that be in the future? We cannot trade it off now by just doing things anyhow. We need to ensure that the pathway is green, the pathway is sustainable. So, if you take pollution, for example, if we don't manage the industries properly and the way they manage waste, you can then generate waste that then goes into the river and the lakes, and the government spends thousands of dollars or millions of dollars trying to treat that waste. That is where the trade-off comes in. So, just to conclude, in the interest of time, it is important for us to look into the importance of water and environment as part of the Sustainable Development Agenda, as part of NDP 3 implementation, and therefore they would contribute both from the agriculture sector, the environment sector, the tourism sector, the transport sector, the fisheries sector. It is very important, and we have to manage that relationship between nature and people as we move forward because of the importance of securing that for the future of the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Elsie. To Dr. Grace Adongo, Uganda's economy is going to continue relying on the available stock of water, the environmental and natural resources to produce the needed goods and services. How has the Ministry of Water and Environment positioned itself to ensure that water and environmental security is assured for the country? Are we doing enough as the ministry, as government? Is what we have done so far adequate?
Okay, thank you very much, moderator. Just as said, and my previous speakers have said, water and environment is fundamental. And it's also recognized in the Vision 2040 for Uganda as an opportunity which can help to catalyze industrialization in Uganda. As a ministry, we have positioned ourselves in various ways. One of them is to ensure that government provides the appropriate enabling environment for sustainable development and management of the water resources. That is why we have a dedicated institution, Ministry of Water and Environment, to look at this pertinent issue. Secondly, we have also set up various institutions that enables us to monitor, regulate, and develop the water resources and the environment resources in an even and sustainable manner. The ministry has not only done that, we realize that most of the stakeholders in water and environment, that is the whole population of Uganda, are not aware of the importance water and environment has in social and economic development of Uganda. Most of the time, people take water and environment for granted. They think it is God-given, it is there, and I'm sure even they are doubting Thomases because as I'm talking, you're looking at Lake Victoria. Now, if I say the water is not available, nobody will understand. So one of the key things is it caused us to rethink how we can implement management and development of water resources and environment in this country together with stakeholders. So it was very important that we launched the Uganda Water and Environment Week as a platform that brings stakeholders together to dialogue, to exchange knowledge and experience, to share findings from practitioners and experts so that we can build our capacity and have a positive mindset towards water and environment. We also realize that in most cases, water resources and environment is looked at as an environment issue, not a development issue. We are here to put to all stakeholders that management and development of water and environment is a development issue and must be put at the center. Just as we have heard today, the country depends on its stock of natural resources, and these natural resources are interconnected, and we need to know, and we are having increased demand for these water resources because the population is increasing and we want to transform the country into a middle-income country, so the demands for these natural resources are increasing. And yet we must make sure that we have proper management for the people right now and the future. So as a ministry, we are doing a lot of awareness campaigns, sensitization. We have established a Water Resource Institute to share case studies of best practices, do applied research, do dialogue, and train on what works. We have not only stopped there. We have a robust monitoring system which we are continuously upgrading to cope up with the technology so that we are able to monitor and forecast, understand water and environment, so that we can talk in terms of figures. We have not stopped there. We have now we realize that maybe technical people, we scientists, have been talking among ourselves and yet to negotiate for more resources